Welcome to the first episode in a three-part Legendarium series about the history of Thanksgiving. In Part 1, Rough Beginnings, we will talk about how hardship and conflict marred the first Thanksgivings held in North America. Thanksgiving Day is a national holiday in the United States, and Thanksgiving 2021 will occur on Thursday, November 25th. Our modern Thanksgiving is associated with a 1621 feast held between the Plymouth colonists and the Wampanoag. Yet Europeans held the first Thanksgiving in 1578, more than 40 years before the Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth. Arctic explorer Martin Frobisher arrived in modern-day Canada searching for the fabled Northwest Passage, which would supposedly take Europeans straight to Asia through the Americas. This was his third such voyage to the region. By November, he already lost one of his ships to the ice of the Canadian Arctic. To keep spirits high, he and his men paused to hold Mass, enjoy a meal, and give thanks for the fact that they still lived. Frobisher's men enjoyed a scrumptious one-course feast of salted beef rations and stale crackers. Delicious. They held their feast amid the ice of what would eventually be called Frobisher Bay, and it became known as the first Canadian Thanksgiving. Yet when Frobisher failed to find the oars that he promised Queen Elizabeth, he returned home, though he was likely thankful that he returned home alive. In September 1620, a small ship called the Mayflower left Plymouth, England, carrying 102 passengers. They included religious separatists seeking a new home where they could freely practice their faith. Others came in search of land ownership in North America. Such men made up a majority of the passengers, not those who would be called the Pilgrims. After a treacherous and uncomfortable crossing that lasted 66 days, they dropped anchor near the tip of Cape Cod, far north of their intended destination at the mouth of the Hudson River. 1 month later, the Mayflower crossed Massachusetts Bay, where the Pilgrims, as they are now known, began the work of building a village at Plymouth. They could only settle in the region because previous Europeans brought diseases, which wiped out most of the indigenous population. The Puritans took this calamity as a sign that God favored their cause. Throughout their first winter, most of the colonists remained on board the ship, where they suffered from exposure, scurvy, and outbreaks of contagious disease. Only half the Mayflower's original passengers and crew lived to see their first New England spring. In March, the surviving settlers moved ashore. There, they received an astonishing visit from a member of the Abenaki Nation who greeted them in English. Several days later, he returned with another man named Squanto, a member of the Pawtuxet tribe, kidnapped by an English sea captain and sold into slavery years ago. He escaped to London and returned to his homeland on an English exploratory expedition. Squanto taught the Pilgrims, then weakened by malnutrition and illness, how to cultivate corn, extract sap from maple trees, catch fish in the rivers, and avoid poisonous plants, which makes a first Thanksgiving much more pleasant. Squanto also helped the settlers forge an alliance with the Wampanoag, a local tribe, which would endure for more than 50 years and tragically remains one of the sole examples of peace between European colonists and Native Americans. The first Thanksgiving in what would become the United States happened in 1621, after the Pilgrims enjoyed a bountiful harvest. The Pilgrims brought with them a tradition of providential celebrations, days of fasting during difficult times, and days of feasting to thank God during days of plenty. That year, Plymouth Colony invited their neighbors from the Wampanoag tribe to join them for such a celebration. At first, the Pilgrims planned on holding a series of solemn church services to thank God for the harvest. However, when Chief Massasoit arrived with 90 men and announced that he preferred a feast and a celebration, the Pilgrim Fathers suddenly decided that the chief had a better idea. Of course, Pilgrims and Wampanoag would not have eaten pie, stuffing, or cranberry sauce since they had no potatoes or sugar. For the most part, they ate meat, mainly venison and pigeons. They also had some unfamiliar choices like roasted swan, lobster, clams, and they even feasted upon a freshly caught seal. Pilgrims held their second Thanksgiving celebration in 1623 to mark the end of a long drought that threatened the year's harvest. The seemingly heaven-sent rain prompted Governor Bradford to call for a religious fast in which the Pilgrims swore off food and drink to thank God. Days of Thanksgiving on an occasional basis became common practice in other New England settlements as more and more English Protestants arrived in what would be called New England. Tragically, one friendly meal did not mean the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag had an everlasting peace. Nearly 50 years later, the English of New England went to war with the son of Chief Massasoit named Metacomet, though the English called him King Philip because of his prideful nature. When New Englanders began taking land from indigenous allies of the Wampanoag, Metacomet waged a brutal war, attacking more than half the English settlements in New England. He killed more than 600 people, and given that New England only had 20,000 people at the time, that makes it America's costliest war per capita to date. In the end, though, after nearly a year of combat between the English and the indigenous nations, the Pilgrims ran down Metacomet, dismembered his body, and put his head on a pole overlooking Plymouth. It stayed there for 25 years, Metacomet's skull looking down on the spot where his father and the Pilgrims celebrated the first Thanksgiving. That wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.